French tanks of World War II to cavalry tanks and AF's early efforts at cavalry mechanization. As was the case elsewhere in Western Europe, World War I was the swan song of traditional French horse cavalry. The cavalry continued to exist in the French army, but in a very diminished and distorted form. A number of cavalry divisions were still present in the order of battle, but they fought on foot and differed little from the ordinary infantry. After the war, the French army still saw potential use for horse cavalry to conduct reconnaissance, flank security, and liaison operations, but largely as a servant of the infantry. The idea of the cavalry as the mobile arm of decision on the battlefield was in serious doubt. A secondary reason for the retention of the cavalry was their value in the colonies, especially in North Africa and the Levant, where they still had their utility. The cavalry had dabbled in mechanization as early as 1902 in the form of armored cars. They were generally designated as automitrailleuse AM, machine gun cars, or autocannons AC, gun cars depending on their armament. They saw combat use in the mobile opening phase of the war, but became increasingly irrelevant with the stagnation of trench warfare. Early armored cars were based on conventional automobile chassis, and they were overburdened with armor, underpowered, and susceptible to becoming bogged down off the road. There was a brief flurry of use in the final year of the war with the arrival of improved designs and greater opportunities for mobile missions. To their credit, senior French commanders saw cavalry as focused on a mission rather than defined by the horse. The most influential cavalry officer of the interwar period, Jean-Maxime Weygand, wrote an influential article in the very first post-war issue of the Revue de Cavalerie in 1921. He argued that trench warfare is the negation of war, since war always seeks a decision which can only be produced through movement. The cavalry will keep its raison d'etre as long as speed and surprise are valued on the battlefield. The war of tomorrow will be, more than ever, a war of machines. The more far-sighted cavalry leaders saw the esprit cavalier tied to mobility rather than to the horse. The French cavalry continued to develop the armored car, but recognized from the outset that it was road-bound. The standard practice was to form mixed scouting groups of armored cars and motorcycles, with the motorcycles used for cross-country scouting at the beginning of the 1930s. The cavalry's armored force in metropolitan France consisted of 11 squadrons of white TPC armored cars left over from World War I. Of the 230 armored cars still on hand, about half were modernized between 1931 and 1933 by rebuilding them on Lafley truck chassis with 50 engines. These were called AMD Lafley 50M or White Lafley. The problem facing the French cavalry in the 1920s was the lack of funding and the weakness of the technology. Tanks were a possible solution, but they were too slow, and the post-war reorganization put them under infantry control. In spite of this, the French cavalry units experimented with use of mixed tank armored car raiding groups. Renault FT tanks were carried piggyback on heavy trucks for speed, and the tanks were disembarked when needed for combat missions. The motomobile groups of the early 1920s were an interesting precursor of the later mechanized divisions. The panacea for the French cavalry in the 1920s was the half-track. This technology seemed to offer essential cross-country capability as well as superior speed to contemporary tanks. Most of their early experimental work focused on Citroën Cagresse system. Adolphe Cagresse was born in France but emigrated to Russia in 1905, where he worked in the Imperial Auto Park of the Tsar. He developed a half-track system using rubber band tracks to improve the mobility of Tsar's limousines while on hunting expeditions in the Russian countryside. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, he returned to France in 1919 and was hired by Citroën to adopt this suspension system to both commercial and military vehicles. Following a disastrous expedition in Algeria in 1920, when most of the 32 vehicles in a convoy into the Sahara were lost, Jean-Baptiste Estienne proposed using Citroën Cagresse half-tracks. A convoy of 5 vehicles crossed the Sahara and reached Timbuktu in the winter of 1922-23. This led to several other expeditions around the globe that highlighted their remarkable cross-country value of the Citroën Cagresse system. In light of the publicity attending the use of the Citroën Cagresse system, there were a number of experimental half-track AFVs built between 1922 and 1925. The only one to reach series production was the Citroën P4T. It had a rear-mounted turret with a 37mm gun, and 14 were built. Some were sent to cavalry units in the Levant, but it proved to be too weakly powered. The more robust AMC Automitrailleuse de Cavalerie P16 was developed by 1928. This used an improved Citroën Cagresse suspension and a more powerful Panhard 60 horsepower engine, providing a sustained road speed of 30 km per hour. 18 miles per hour, though it could be pushed to 47 km per hour, 29 miles per hour for short periods. The first four pilots were assembled by Schneider on Citroën chassis starting in 1928. After some refinements, the French cavalry placed an order for 96 vehicles in 1930, with deliveries complete by 1931. In the meantime, Citroën proposed its own half-track AMC. This was based on its experimental infantry resupply vehicle Type N, a losing competitor to the Renault UI. The resulting AMC Citroën P28 was an attractive design with a center-mounted turret. The cavalry ordered 50 in October 1931. However, they proved to be an extreme disappointment in all respects. A total of 44 remained in French cavalry service for instruction, and 3 were exported to Uruguay. The half-track AMC proved to be a technological dead end for the French cavalry. As Jen Wagen noted during the September 1932 War Games, the AMC that were conceived of a decade ago are obsolete from the moment they leave the factory. Although they offered better cross-country mobility than the old Whittemord cars, they were far from satisfactory. The Wagen reformskin Maxime Wagen became head of the General Staff in January 1930 and vice president of the Superior Council of War through January 1935. His July 1930 reform plan envisioned the motorization of several infantry divisions and a complete overhaul of the cavalry. Wagen saw the need to return the cavalry to its role as the decisive arm of maneuver on the battlefield, and felt that the only way to accomplish this was through mechanization. He received significant support from within the cavalry itself, including influential officers such as Jean Flavigny, Directeur de la Cavalerie from 1931 to 1936. Others, such as Cavalry Inspector General Jean-Charles Burcard, were more skeptical due to the costs and technological risks. The existing experiments with half-track armored cars and Dragon Portees motorized dragoons carried on half-track trucks had proven encouraging, but existing vehicles were not especially robust during prolonged war games. In the event, the cavalry began by mechanizing 1 brigade and 4 of the new light cavalry divisions and began completely mechanizing a single cavalry division in 1933. The onset of the Great Depression severely undermined any more extensive effort until late in the decade. The Wagen reforms envisioned the use of 3 types of cavalry armored vehicles, all dubbed armored cars automitrailleuse to avoid stepping on the toes of the infantry, who were still nominally in charge of tanks. The Automitrailleuse de Découverte AMD was intended for the traditional cavalry role of deep reconnaissance along the main roads. This designation was usually applied to traditional wheeled or half-track armored cars. The Automitrailleuse de Reconnaissance armor was intended to provide close reconnaissance for the Dragon Portees regiments. This type of vehicle eventually emerged as a light tank armed with machine guns. The Automitrailleuse de Combat AMC was the primary fighting vehicle of cavalry, sufficiently armed to engage enemy tanks. The first AMC was Schneider P16 half-track, but future plans envisioned it as a fast-medium tank. On paper, the revised 1932 Cavalry Division was expected to include a regiment d'Automitrailleuses RAM, which would have 4 squadrons escadrons with a total of 15 AMD, 15 AMR and 30 AMC. Renault R35. Although the half-track armor had proven more satisfactory than wheeled armored cars, they had marginal cross-country performance. The decision by the cavalry in 1931 to purchase 50 AMR P28 from the rival Citroën automotive firm prompted Louis Renault to use company funds to develop a full-track rival to the Citroën Cagresse half-tracks. The Renault VM was a very small, 2-man tank about the size of the older Renault FT. A major objective of the Renault effort was for higher road speeds than possible with the old Renault FT, based on the use of the new narrow pitch tracks inspired by the British Carden Loyd tankette. The armament was quite puny, only a single machine gun, since the vehicle was intended for reconnaissance. To keep the size small, the engine was mounted asymmetrically in the fighting compartment on the right side. A total of 5 pilots were built with different suspensions to examine the technical value of each. The first pilot was sent to the Steam Commission in Vincennes in the summer of 1932 for trials, followed by the other pilots as they were ready. In December 1932, the Commission reported that the Renault VM satisfied the AMR requirement. On March 8, 1933, Renault was awarded a contract for 45 tanks as the Renault Model 1933, usually abbreviated as R35. The first was delivered on June 1, 1934, and subsequent contracts brought the total to 118 serial production tanks by the time production was completed in 1935. Two pilots were rebuilt, so a total production of 120 R33 is often cited. Renault R35. Although the cavalry found the new Renault R33 to be a significant imprint in mobility and speed over the old half-tracks, the small size and cramped interior caused problems. In a discussion with Jean Flavigny in 1934, Renault was told that there had been complaints from R33 test crews who came quite fatigued on missions of 150 kilometers due to the noise and vibrations of the side-mounted engine. Flavigny indicated that a more conventional rear-mounted engine was desirable. The resulting Renault ZT returned to a more conventional layout with the engine mounted in the rear. The larger hull permitted a larger turret that could accommodate more powerful weapons. A pilot was delivered to Vincennes for trials in April 1934. The commission concluded that the ZT was a definite improvement over the earlier R33, and in view of the ominous political developments in Germany, recommended a contract extension for a further 100 tanks. These were designated as the Renault Model 1935, usually abbreviated as R35. Deliveries of the R35 began in April 1936. There were two standard turret configurations for the vehicles: Drill Avis No. 1 armed with the 7.5 mm machine gun and Avis No. 2 armed with Hotchkiss 13.2 mm heavy machine gun. A third variant, the ADF-1 Voiture der Commandant des Squadron Commander's vehicle, had a modified turret with a large loop antenna fitted along with a pair of command radios. Two additional contracts followed in 1936, bringing the total to 200 R33 of all variants. The original type with machine gun armament was subsequently called the ZT-1, and through the end of 1938 when production ended, a total of 167 AMR-35 ZT-1 87 7.5 mm and 81 13.2 mm Waspel. Production of the ADF-1 Squadron Command Vehicle totaled 13. During the course of production, the cavalry expressed interest in a version armed with the new T5 anti-tank gun that could be used by their reconnaissance groups attached to infantry divisions. GRDIO, Group du Reconnaissance de Division d'Infanterie. A version with the PX5 turret was developed as the Renault ZT2, and a turretless version with the gun and a casemate mounting was developed as the ZT3. Due to delays in the manufacture of the PX5 turret, deliveries of the Renault ZT2 did not begin until 1939. 10 of each type were built, rounding out the production contract of the 200 R35. Curiously enough, a specialized version, the AMR-35 ZT4 was in development in 1940 as a type colonies for use in Indochina to replace the old Renault FT tanks. These had better ventilation and cooling in the hull for use in tropical conditions. A total of 55 were on order in 1940, the first 18 of which were to be armed with the existing Renault turret, and the remainder with the Avis turrets. Only 3 hulls were completed prior to the fall of France. Besides the basic Renault R35, there was also some Army interest in specialist command vehicles based on the chassis. A requirement had been established in 1931 for a Voiture de Commandement et de Liaisons Blindées type MVCLB, Armored Command and Liaison Vehicle. Renault offered its original Type YS for this requirement in September 1933, based on the R33 chassis but with a large fixed superstructure. This was satisfactory enough that a contract was awarded in April 1930 for 410 of the vehicles. Due to delays, the 10 serial production Renault YS were built on the newer R35 chassis. These were completed in the spring of 1938 as Renault YS Voiture Commandement, with for going to the cavalry, to the mechanized infantry in the armored divisions, to infantry tank units, and to artillery for experimentation. In contrast to the AMR-35 tank, the Renault YS had the engine moved into the front of the hull to provide more space in the rear. An enlarged superstructure was fitted in the rear to accommodate up to 6 troops, including command staff and radio operators. The artillery branch wanted a more elaborate voiture blindées terrains observation artillery all-terrain artillery observation vehicle. Renault offered the YS2, which was based on the existing YS design, but fitted with a cast turret incorporating an optical rangefinder. A single pilot was deployed with artillery regiment of the 2 DLM division Leger Mechanic prior to the Battle of France, but it never entered series production. The Armor 33 and Armor 35 were the only types of cavalry scout tanks to enter series production before 1940. However, a number of other designs were offered to the cavalry, including the Citroën P103 light tank and Gendron SOMUA and Berliet VUDB for armored cars. The cavalry was never entirely happy with the Armor 35 and wanted more speed for their reconnaissance role. In 1934, SOMUA displayed the pilot of a new armored car design developed in conjunction with Gendron. After initial trials, a second prototype was delivered in late 1937 and was accepted for production at the outbreak of the war in September 1939 as the Gendron SOMUA Model 39. A total of 150 was ordered, with delivery scheduled to begin in August 1940. Gen Maurice Gamelin opposed their production due to its weak armor, and in the event none were manufactured. Cavalry tank. The Renault Wagen envisioned a more heavily armored and heavily armed F as part of the cavalry mechanization scheme, euphemistically called in automitrailleuse de combat to avoid interference from the infantry. That program began in December 1931, and Renault offered its wire tank design, SOMUA its AC half-track and Fromajet Badagnolus its wheeled tank design. The Renault wire was essentially an upscaled VM with the engine mounted in rear. A soft steel pilot was sent to Reims in September 1933 for trials, fitted with an APX-1C turret. This fulfilled basic requirements for the AMC and was more mature than the other designs. Since the AMC was intended to be capable of fighting enemy tanks, the definitive APX-2 turret with 25mm gun was developed separately. Curiously this was the first of the new turrets being developed by APX in the early 1930s to accommodate a two-man crew. Due to the growing crisis with Germany and the need to rapidly equip first of the new mechanized cavalry divisions, Renault received a production contract for 12 AMC-30 for vehicles in March 1934. The AMC-30 for tanks were delivered starting in October 1935, but without turrets. Some were temporarily fitted with Renault FT turrets, and in the event, only the last 6 vehicles were delivered with the APX-2 turret. By the time that the AMC-34 had arrived, they had already fallen behind in technology. The suspension was based on the older Armor 33 Renault VM, while the Armor 35 Renault ZT used a new and more robust suspension. In addition, the 20mm armor was recognized as insufficient once the German army began adopting the 37mm anti-tank gun, and likewise the 25mm gun was felt to be inferior to newer options. As a result, Renault substantially liquefied the design as the CG-1 autocannon de cavalerie CC cavalry assault gun with heavier armor and the 47mm SA-35 gun. To pilots were delivered in March 1936 and a contract was awarded for 48 tanks, which were delivered from November 1938 to February 1940. Of these, one was reconfigured as the CG-2 armed with a hull-mounted 75mm gun as used in the Char B tank family. This vehicle was never finished. Production of the AMC-35 Renault CG-1 was very limited, as by this time the cavalry had settled on the much larger and more powerful SOMUA S35 for its AMC requirement. Indeed, the CG-1 was not issued to any cavalry units until the final weeks of the 1940 campaign, when it was used to form improvised units. Besides the production for the French army, the Belgian army selected this design and ordered 25 tanks. This project was heavily criticized in Belgium, where the deployment of such powerful tanks was viewed in some corners as a provocation against Germany and a threat to Belgian neutrality. In the event, a single prototype was delivered, followed by 10 series production tanks fitted with the slightly different AMX-2 turret armed with a Belgian 47mm gun. Cavalry tank. The SOMUA S35 SOMUA's original AC half-track proposal for theme requirement reached the prototype stage in 1933. But there was little cavalry interest in the design due to the recognition that the fully tracked Renault wire offered better cross-country performance. The cavalry was unwilling to write off SOMUA's potential contributions to the mechanization effort, since there was some concern that Renault's Billancourt plant was overwhelmed with infantry orders, including the UE infantry tractor, the R35 light tank and the B1 battle tank. SOMUA was encouraged to offer a tank design for the AMC requirement and submitted a design in October 1934. The suspension design was undertaken by Eugene Brilly, a Schneider engineer who had designed the first French tank, the Schneider C1. Curiously enough, Brilly had also been involved in the design of the suspension of a tank being developed at the time by another Schneider subsidiary, the WWII-35 in Czechoslovakia, perhaps better known by its later German designation, PZKPFW-35T. The similarity between the SOMUA and PZKPFW-35T suspension is not widely appreciated, since the SOMUA suspension was hidden under a metal cowling. The C3 pilot was delivered in April 1935, minus the turret, which was under development by APX. The SOMUA C3 made extensive use of large armor castings for its hull and had an armor basis of 40 mm, which was 1. Renault R35, 3. Group d'Automitrailleuses, Paris 1938. The initial batches of the R35 with the Avis No. 1 turret were painted in the simple fashion seen on Renault products in 1935 and 1936, with a simple pattern of yellow ochre over army olive green. The 3 EGM insignia was usually painted on the turret sides as seen here, but other tactical markings were minimal at this time. 2 Renault R35, 6 East Escadron, 1 RRDP, 2 EDLM, Dunkirk, June 1940. This R35 with the Avis No. 2 turret comes from the flamboyant period of Renault camouflage painting, with a band of pale pastel yellow janitor besides the usual army green, gray and sapphire brown. Aside from the white tactical number on the turret rear, no other markings are visible on side. The 6E Escadron AMR of the 2E Battalion, 1 RRDP had its own tactical insignia of a diamond bisected in red and blue that was usually carried on the forward side of the hull. It is not evident on this particular tank. The insignia of the 2E DLM, the usual cavalry blue diamond but surmounted by a white cross of Lorraine, was usually carried on the hull front on the right side, a transmission access bulge, judged sufficient to withstand the new German 37mm anti-tank gun at typical combat ranges. As a result, the prototype was overweight, 17 tons versus the specified 13 tons. Although the Vincennes Commission was pleased with the tank's cross-country performance, there were numerous mechanical shortcomings with the engine and other features. After modifications were made, trials resumed between October and December 1935. A second pilot tank was delivered with a temporary mounting for an APX-1 turret. Tests on this version were conducted from July 1936 to March 1937, which revealed the need for a new engine, wider tracks, and better hull ventilation. The SOMUA design had proved so promising that an initial production contract for 50 was awarded in March 1936 for the definitive AC for design as Char D Cavalieri 1935S, more often known as the SOMUA S35. 4 production tanks were delivered in the summer of 1937 to ensure that the upgrades were adequate. These still had the old APX-1 turret. The definitive production tanks were fitted with the new APX-1C turret, the C indicating an enlarged turret ring. This turret was very similar in overlappance to the APX-4 turret used on the Char B1 dis, but it had a wider turret ring. The intention was to permit the use of a 1.5-man turret crew. The tank commander sat inside the turret, but the turret ring was wide enough that the radio operator in the hull could stand up on the right side and assist the commander in loading the gun. The SOMUA S35 was designed from the outset for a radio transceiver. However, shortages of radios generally limited the use to platoon commanders, roughly 1 in 5 tanks. Even after the various technical problems on the pilots had been solved, the manufacturing process proved troublesome. The casting of large armored components was still very technologically advanced in 1937, and led to continual delays in deliveries and orders. At the start of the war in September 1939, the cavalry had ordered 500 S-35 tanks, of which 270 had been completed by SOMUA, 248 delivered to the army, and 191 deployed with cavalry units. By June 1, 1940, a total of 417 SOMUA S-35 of the 600 on order had been delivered, though many had not been issued to cavalry units and more recent deliveries were still without turret or armament. The difficulties with manufacturing sufficient tanks due to the bottleneck of the casting foundries led to a substantial redesign effort, substituting steel plate for castings. The new ARL-to-C welded turret was armed with the same 7 gun as the production tank. A pilot with a wooden turret mock-up was completed by April 1940, and there were hopes that the resulting S40 might be ready to replace the existing S35 on the production lines by July 1940. A production contract for the first 50 S40 tanks was awarded on September 21, 1939. The plan was to fit the usual APX-01C turret to the first 80 tanks, and then to switch to the ARL-to-C turret. The pilot was never completed, though there were some attempts to revive the production after the armistice, as mentioned below. The accidental cavalry tank, the Hotchkiss H35. Although the Hotchkiss H35 light tank was rejected during the competition for the new infantry tank, trials of the prototypes continued at Vincennes. In summer of 1935, the new War Minister, Jean Fabry, and chief of the 1 SOMUA S35, 1E Escadron, 2 Cuirassiers, 3 DLM, Belgium 1940. This tank matricule 10,697 follows the coloring style of the initial batch of S35s, which had horizontal bands of army green and earth brown with a band of light blue-gray on top. These 35 tanks were in the regiment's first 2 squadrons, so were numbered around 50 to 73. This was carried in the side and repeated on the left rear turret panel. The regiment sometimes used the emblem of the Sun King, Louis XIV, on the whole side. Based on the regimental insignia, the national cockade was carried on the turret cupola, turret right rear panel, and centrally on the hull rear upper casting. 2 SOMUA S35, 3 Escadron, 18 Dragons, 1 Air DLM, Belgium 1940. The final camouflage scheme on the S35 was this pattern of vertical bands of army green, medium green, and earth brown, separated by thin black edging. The unit insignia, the hippogriff, is carried inside the squadron symbol, in this case a diamond. The national cockade was painted on the whole side, turret cupola, and right rear turret rear. General Staff, Gen Gamelin. So one of the Hotchkiss tanks take part in trials at the obstacle course at Vincennes alongside one of the early SOMUA S35 prototypes. The SOMUA at this stage was very unimpressive, lacking its turret, and its automotive performance was uninspiring. In contrast, the small Hotchkiss proceeded through the course with little difficulty. Fabry became a strong proponent of the Hotchkiss, and insisted to Gamelin that it proceed to production in place of the SOMUA. Fabry was largely unaware of the technical characteristics of the SOMUA, particularly its thicker armor, better gun, and 3-man crew. Jean Flavigny, the father of the new cavalry light mechanized divisions and a strong proponent of the SOMUA, attempted to discourage production of the Hotchkiss. The cavalry did not like the Hotchkiss since its 37mm gun was not suitable for cavalry tactical doctrine, which considered tank fighting part of its mission. Nor was the one-man turret attractive. The cavalry was shifting to 2-man turrets on the Hummer, AMC and AMD. The infantry did not want any Hotchkiss models due to the various technical faults uncovered during the previous trials. Gamelin eventually succumbed to political pressure from Fabry, and authorized an initial contract for 200 tanks that was awarded on November 6, 1935. Since the infantry adamantly opposed the type, he directed them to the cavalry on grounds that it would provide an interim capability for the Noodle until the SOMUA became available. Delivery of the Hotchkiss Char D Cavalry H35 proved slower than anticipated. The first tanks were delivered in July 1936. By January 1, 1937, a total of 157 had been delivered by the St. Denis plant, but in reality they were still awaiting turrets from the government APX depot. A second contract for a further 100 tanks was awarded on September 7, 1936, with delivery from July to November 1937. Once again, actual deliveries to cavalry units were delayed by the need to complete the tanks with government-furnished components such as the turret, vision devices, and weapons. At the start of war in September 1939, all 300 cavalry H-35 had been delivered, of which 232 were in units, 16 were on overseas assignments, 44 were still in depots, and 8 were being used for trials or other assignments. In spite of Flavigny's opinions over the selection of the Hotchkiss H-35, its availability before arrival of the SOMUA S35 did help the cavalry to mechanize faster. The 1E DLM was equipped in the early part of 1938 and the 2 East DLM by the summer. Expedient tank, the Hotchkiss H-39. Neither the infantry nor cavalry wanted the H-35, and its service use did little to convince them otherwise. The French army found that the tank was sluggish and that the transmission was ill-suited to steering. In spite of its technical shortcomings, the Hotchkiss plan continued to receive orders from the army due to political pressure from the government and some factions within the army. The Controller General of the Army, Robert Jacquarnet, was supportive of further contracts because the Hotchkiss plant at St. Denis was not operating at full capacity at a time when tank deliveries from other plants, including Renault, were running badly behind schedule. Hotchkiss attempted to ameliorate the design with a thorough modernization effort that culminated in the H39 in 1938. This version substituted a more powerful 120 horsepower engine along with an associated enlargement of the rear hull casting. This increased maximum speed from 28 km/h 17 mph to 36 km/h 23 mph, but reduced the range from 150 to 120 km 93 to 75 meters. The H35 suspension was prone to losing the rubber from its road wheels, so the modified suspension used steel-rimmed wheels. To accommodate the added weight, the tracks were widened from 25 to 27 centimeters. Hotchkiss referred to the new version as Char B1 1938 series, sometimes abbreviated as 38H. This designation was not adopted by the Army, which called it the Char B1 1935H Modify 1939 or H39. An initial contract for 400 H39 tanks was awarded in July 1938 with about of go into the cavalry. The first batch of H39 tanks was delivered in February 1939, though without guns or armament. At the start of the war in September 1939, no H39s had been delivered to the cavalry. A total of 680 H39s had been delivered by the end of May 1940 and 703 had been completed at the factory by June 1, 1940. The 37mm SA-18 gun on the Hotchkiss had been based on infantry requirements. The Spanish Civil War had revealed the need for tanks to be able to fight other tanks, and this led to the development of the long 37mm SA-38 gun, which entered production at the end of 1939. This was mounted in H-39 tanks starting around No. 480. Due to lingering shortages, they were issued on a scale of 1 long 37mm gun per 3 cavalry tanks peloton a platoon commander and 1 per every 4 infantry tanks section commander. By April 1940, 358 of the new guns had been completed and a total of about 800 were completed by the end of the 1940 campaign. These were mounted primarily on the H-39, but some were fitted to the R35 and R40, and a small number were retrofitted to the older H-35 and cavalry units. The infantry requested the addition of an indiching tail on the Hotchkiss, and this started to be fitted in March 1940. Eyes of the cavalry, the Panzer AMD-35 at the outset of the war in September 1939, the cavalry had 344 armored cars deployed in its units in France. More than a third of these were old types, including 29 of the vintage AMD White TPC, 43 of the rebuilt AMD Lafley 50, and 74 of the half-track AMC Schneider K-Grass. The most important cavalry armored car was the Panzer AMD-35, which became the standard type by its start of the fighting in May 1940. A requirement for a new armored car suitable for deep scouting was approved on December 22, 1931 on the basis of the Wagon reform plans, and the details were modified in December 1932. Four firms competed, offering the Renault VZ, the Berlietbook, the Panhard 178, and the Lateland. The Panhard at Levasseur design was a break from previous French armored car designs, which built the vehicle around an existing truck chassis with a front-mounted engine. The Panhard Voiture Specially 178 had a fully armored body with integral chassis and a rear-mounted Panhard SK-105 engine. In its prototype form, it was armed with a Hotchkiss 13mm heavy matching gun and a turret developed at Vincennes. By the time of its production, the PX-3 turret had been developed at the government arsenal and it was 1 Hotchkiss H-35, 3 Escadron AMC, 2 EGOM, 2 Division Cavalerie, 1939. The pre-war cavalry tank squadrons were often colorfully marked. The base finish of this tank is usual early Hotchkiss scheme of ochre blotches edged in black on a base army green finish. The cavalry regiments typically use the traditional playing card symbols, with the color indicating the squadron and the shape indicating the troop peloton. Date 1er, Heart 2e, Time and 3 East, Club 4e. Tactical numbers were lower than in the regiments. Uni crests were often painted on the tanks, frequently on the tactical symbol. The turret cupola has been painted with the national cockard. 2 Hotchkiss H35, 3 Escadron, 18 E-Dragons, 1 RDLM, Belgium 1940. The first production batch of Hotchkiss H35 delivered to the cavalry was typically finished in asham of army green with blotches of yellow ochre jawn with a black edging. A very tie-off markings were added to the unit's tanks in 1939-40, including a cockard roundel on the rear turret hatch and white tactical numbers. Since this was the 2nd Regiment of the brigade, the tactical numbers of the tanks were over 46, usually 50 to 99. The regimental insignia, the legendary hippogriff, is carried on a shield rather than a playing card symbol, since this was a common tank. This tank has had several improvements since original delivery, including replacement off-turret visors and the addition of a radio and its associate armored box on the front left fender. Armed with a version of the 25mm anti-tank gun, the SA-35. The pilots were fitted with a small track under the center of the chassis to assist in undetching the vehicle in deep mud. However, this feature was complex and not very useful, so it was dropped. The crew consisted of 4, the driver, a 2-man turret crew, and an inverser. The Panhard had dual driving controls to permit it to be steered backward, and the inverser was seated in the rear of the vehicle in the event that the vehicle had to be driven in reverse. The Panhard 178, like most cavalry vehicles, was designed to accommodate a radio, usually the 26er that was located in the hull on the left side north gunner. The Panhard utilized riveted construction of the armor plate, with 20mm frontal armor and 9 to 13mm side and top armor. Trials of the Panhard 178 were undertaken at Vincennes starting in January 1934. The trials proceeded satisfactorily, and the design proved top robust. The Commission recommended adopting the Panhard over its competitors on February 15, 1934, though with a variety of small changes. Testing continued, including an arduous set of trials in Morocco in 1936. The first production contract for 30 vehicles was awarded on February 1, 1935 under the designation Automitrailleuse de Découverte Panhard Modèle 1935, usually abbreviated as AMD-35. In cavalry service, the Panhard was nicknamed the Pan-Pan. The first vehicles were scheduled for delivery starting in January 1936, but the plant became caught up in the labor unrest that roiled the country in the spring of 1936. As a result, the first vehicles were delivered in February 1937. At the time of the outbreak of the war in September 1939, 217 had been delivered, rising to 370 by May 10, 1940. A total of 543 of all types were manufactured by the time of the armistice, 5 to unfinished due to a lack of turrets. There were several variants of the MD-35. The Voiture Blind EPC Por 27 was a radio command vehicle fitted with their 27 radio station. That lacked the usual 25mm gun, and radio masts were fitted forward and aft. A total of 24 was ordered in 1937 and 1938 and built in 1939. These were employed by the regimental headquarters section, with 1 per regiment. They served in the TDLM and 3 DLC in 1940. A further 150 were ordered in April 1940, though none of these were completed. Two colonial versions of the Panhard were manufactured. The AMD-35 type colonies was intended for use in the tropical colonies, especially Indochina. It was a lighter vehicle fitted with the PX-5 turret and had a 3-man crew. An initial batch of 4 vehicles was sent to Indochina in October 1939 and 3 more without turrets in January 1940. The AMD-35 TYPAF and Afrique Francaise du Nord was another colonial version fitted with a special radiator for operations in hot climates. Although plans were underway to fit it with a heavier gun in the 37mm or 47mm range, the initial production contracts kept the standard APX-3 turret. A total of 128 were ordered for 8 squadrons, but delays in the manufacture of the special radiator delayed the first deliveries until mid-May 1940. By then, it was too late to send them to North Africa. About 80 were completed and were used by cavalry units in the final stage of the 1940 campaign in France. The Voiture Specially 207 was a tank destroyer version of the Panhard, armed with a rear-facing 47mm SA-37 anti-tank gun. This design was never completed. However, during the course of the Battle off France in 1940, a number of AMD-35 hulls were ready but without turrets. Chef d'Escadron Joseph Dostord, commanding the 1 ram of the 1 EDLC, asked the Renault factory at Billancourt to produce a welded turret capable of fitting the standard 47mm SA-35 tank gun. Under the direction of Joseph Restany, it was finished in 4 days and tested on June 5, 1940. It was hastily rushed into service and fought in the 1 ram along the Loire. The majority of AMD-35 was deployed in the 6 squadrons of the Regiments de Découverte and the 3 light mechanized divisions, each with 24 armored cars. A further 5 squadrons were attached to the Regimento Widemeri ram of the light cavalry divisions, each equipped with 17 vehicles. 7 squadrons, each with 16 vehicles, were attached to their reconnaissance groups, the motorized infantry divisions GRDI. A single squadron, the 201 Escadron, was raised to support the Expeditionary Corps underway in 1940. Besides these standard units, a number of improvised cavalry units were hastily equipped with the AMD-35 in the May-June 1940 fighting. In May 1938, the cavalry proposed the amalgamation of the AMD Andemar vehicles into a single vehicle, dubbed the Automitrailleuse Puissante de Cavalerie. Several firms presented concepts, including a SOMUA half-track design. The most promising was the futuristic Panhard 201 design, which was based on a conventional 4x4 configuration, but with 2 additional sets of steel wheels in between the main wheels to assist in extricating the vehicle if it became bogged down. The prototype underwent tests through April 1940. The armament was not fully developed, but an oscillating turret was in development, armed with the 37mm SA-38 gun. Production of 600 Panhard M4OP was ordered on May 1, 1940, with production expected to begin in spring of 1941. In the event, none were manufactured. The prototype was evacuated to Morocco in 1940 and formed the basis for the post-war Panhard armored car. Cavalry mechanization and wagons reforms between 1930 and 1935 started the process of cavalrymachization. During the 1930s, the corps of the French cavalry consisted of several cavalry divisions. Aside from their 4-horse cavalry regiments, these divisions had an armored car groupgum, group d'automitrailleuses, and a mechanized dragoon battalion BDP, Bataillon des Dragons Ports. In February 1940, the 3 remaining divisions were reorganized as light cavalry divisions DLC, Division Leger de Cavalerie, which reduced their horse cavalry element in half to 2-horse cavalry regiments but expanded the mechanized portion into a light motorized brigade. The previous GUM was reorganized as an armored car regiment RAM, Regiment d'automitrailleuses, which included 6 instead of the previous 3 squadrons escadrons. The squadrons usually consisted of 16 vehicles each, and the types varied but usually included a squadron of Hotchkiss light tanks and a squadron of Panhard AMD-35. The mechanized dragoon force in each division doubled to a regiment of 2 battalions. 1 Hotchkiss H39, 1 Cuirassiers, 3 East DLM, Belgium, May 1940. The cavalry did not begin to receive its H39 until after the start of the war. Most were finished in standard late scheme of army green and earth brown, spray-painted in large patterns. The tanks of the 1 East Cuirassiers were usually painted with names on either front side. The vehicle tactical numbers, issued in consecutive order, were painted on the turret sides. The 2 Cuirassiers solely repeated the number on the rear turret corners, splitting the number left to right in the chassis of 2-digit numbers. 2 Hotchkiss H39, 80 Dragons, 7 EDLM, June 1940. The 80 Regiment des Dragons was originally part of the Horse Cavalry Brigade of the 4 East DLC, and it suffered heavy losses during the fighting in Belgium. The remnants of the division were used to form the core of the newly constituted 7 DLM starting on May 24, 1940, equipped with H-39 tanks, including the latest production version with the 37mm SA-38 gun and a ditching tail, such as the Saône. Given its hasty formation, markings were minimal, consisting of the usual 2-tone army green earth brown camouflage, and numerous national cockard insignia due to the problem of fratricide. This regiment saw heavy fighting in the first 2 weeks of June, losing nearly all of its more than 40 tanks. The centerpiece of the mechanization process was the Light Mechanized Division DLM, Division Lagermechanik. The formation of 3 of these divisions was ordered at the end of 1934, although they did not begin formation until 1935. The 1E DLM was created on July 1, 1935 on the basis of the existing 3 Division D Cavalry at Reims and Verdun. The 2E DLM was created in the summer of 1936 on the basis of the 5E Division D Cavalry. The 3E DLM did not begin forming until early 1940. These divisions were intended for the traditional cavalry roles of reconnaissance, flank security for infantry corps, offensive exploitation of breaches in the enemy lines, and defensive responses to enemy breakthroughs. The heart of the division was a pair of brigades. Both were labeled as Brigade Lagermechanik BLM even though they had fundamental different composition. One of these contained main tank elements of the division consisting of 2 regiments D combat. The other brigade consisted of a regiment D de covert reconnaissance regiment based on armored cars and a regiment D Dragonsports RDP, Dragoon regiment of half-track-borne infantry. Since the Hotchkiss H35 was available first, the regiments D combat were heavily reliant on this type until the newer H39 and S35 became available. As more SOMUA tanks became available by 1940, S-35 squadrons were substituted for Hotchkiss squadrons for a half-and-half mix in the regiments. The Regiment D de Covert included 2 squadrons of Hard AMD 35 armored cars and 3 squadrons of Renault R35 reconnaissance tanks. Besides the cavalry divisions, the French cavalry branch also included a variety of smaller formations supporting the other combat arms. The most significant of these were the reconnaissance groups attached to the infantry divisions GRDI, Group D Reconnaissance D Division D Infantry. 5 of these GRDI were mechanized for attachment to the motorized infantry divisions DIM, Division D Infantry Motor EC. These mechanized groups included a squadron of 16 Panhard AMD 35 armored cars and a squadron of 20 armor light reconnaissance tanks French tanks in the 1940 campaign. Technical assessment. The turret problem in general. French tanks were technically well suited to their intended tactical doctrines, but with a number of clear exceptions. On the whole, French tanks were far better protected than German tanks, and their armament was more often capable of defeating German tank armor than vice versa. Nevertheless, there were some glaring technical problems. The single most crucial fault in French tanks in 1940 was the WWII extrude designs. These designs were a continuation of the World War I practice of having a single crewman in the turret. While this might have been acceptable for the slow pace of tank combat in 1918, it was woefully ill-advised by 1940. The French tank crews dubbed this feature the one-man orchestra hum orchestra, since the tank commander had to load, aim, and fire the gun while at the same time attempting to direct this tank within its section and keep an eye out for the enemy. As one cavalry tank section commander noted in his memoirs, once the shooting began, Hack could no longer exercise control over his section, and had a hard time simply tending to his own tank. German accounts of the 1940 campaign almost invariably remark at how slow the French tanks reacted in a mobile battle, as well as the preference of French tank units to fight from static positions. French tank units seemed leaderless, since section commanders had to attempt to deal with too many tasks on their own. The single-man turret dominated French 1940 tank designs as much by inertia as by intent. The Char B1, not surprisingly, followed the one-man design since it was nothing more than a warmed-over OFT. The most unfortunate use of the one-man turret was in the Char B1 and Char B1 bis battle tanks. This was in large measure due to the archaic origins of the design, which was based on 1920 ideas about tank combat. The decision to remain with the one-man turret on the infantry tanks was understandable due to 2 major factors: size and cost limitations on the R35 design, and France's methodical battle tactical doctrine. A one-man turret was more economical than a 2-man turret, since a larger turret would have implied a larger and more expensive tank. This did not seem necessary in the infantry support role since French tactical doctrine was top-down, with the expectation that tank companies would be given clear instructions about their missions from the higher chain of command and then carry them out in a slow and methodical fashion. The French methodical battle doctrine differed from German doctrine, which favored a measure of initiative by the local commander because of the chaos and unpredictability of the modern battlefield. It should also be recalled that a third of the German tanks of 1940, the PZKP-FWI, also used one-man turrets. The exception to the one-man turret should have been the cavalry tanks. French cavalry doctrine anticipated a mobile battle, and many early French armored cars had two-man turrets. The Panhard AMD-35 had a two-man turret. The turret problem crept in at the back door when Gamelin forced the 1. Panhard AMD-35, 4 Peloton, 3 Escadron AMD, 80 Regiment de Cuirassiers, 2 DLM, Belgium 1940. The early Panpans delivered in 1937 like this one usually received the standard army green earth-brown camouflage scheme, separated by a sprayed edge in black. The white detail on the wheel was from a pre-war parade and was probably worn off by the time of the fighting. The regimentus, the traditional playing card symbols with the regimental crest in the center. The 1 Peloton had the symbols in blue and the 3 Escadron AMD in green. Within the squadron, 1 Pelotonus the spade, 2 the heart, 3 the diamond and 4 the club. The national cockard was carried on hull side, turret rear and turret top. The Panpans usually carried a name in capital letters on Douglas's plate. The 4 Peloton, 1/8 the RC named Lepervier, Levader, Lacondon, and Ligel. Panhard AMD-35, 3 Peloton, 2 EGRDI, 9 Division D Infantry Motores, Belgium, May 1940. The later production batches of Panpans were usually finished in the standard scheme of army green and earth brown. Many of the Panpans of this squadron had a cartoon of a charging knight painted on the side, his lance depicted as a stylized 25mm gun. The motto below was Sans peur ni reproches, without fear or reproach. The national cockard insignia was usually carried on the rear. This squadron had distinctive two-color diamond markings for each peloton platoon carried on the right front fender, based on the usual blue cavalry diamond, and shown in detail here. On the left front fender was the usual cavalry marking, a blue diamond and white rectangle, repeated on the right rear fender. The commander, Cap de Villiers-Starrage, had the Panhard mark number 1. The 1 Peloton was numbered to 242E. Peloton was 5 to 7, 3 Peloton was 8 to 1000, 4 was 11 to 13, and 14 to 16 were assigned to a special flying column attached to the corps. The Panpans of the 3 Peloton were all given CAD names based on the group's feline emblem Lechat Huon 8, Lechat Pard 9, and Lechat Tigre 10. This Panpan, commanded by Esperanto-Mieri, was the one used by Jean-Henri Giraud during the attempt to escape encirclement on May 16 to 17 during his campaign against 3 German panzer divisions. Hotchkiss H-35 on the cavalry. Due to the delays with the SOMUA S35, the cavalry becomes saddled with the infantry's troublesome tank configuration. The SOMUA S35 is often described as having a one-man turret, but this is due to a misconception that it shared a common turret with the Char B1 bis. This was not the case, as the SOMUA's APX-1C turret was specifically designed for a so-called 1.5-man configuration, meaning that the loading functions were handled by a second crewman. The SOMUA was limited from having a true 2-man configuration largely due to the specifications, which placed too low a limit on overall weight while setting too high an objective for its armor. To conserve on weight, the tank was unusually narrow for its size, and narrow width impeded the use of a larger turret ring. Technical assessment: the radio gap. Besides the one-man turret problem, French tank units suffered from poorer battlefield coordination than German units. One reason was the disparity in radio use. German units tended to issue radio receivers to all tanks, and radio transmitter receivers to section leaders' tanks. French cavalry tanks follow a similar pattern on paper, though in practice radio distribution was not as complete. Once again, Gamelin's decision to issue the H-35 to the cavalry had deleterious effects, since the tank was too small to comfortably fit a radio where either crew member could actually operate it. French infantry light tanks had no radios in tank units except for a few experimental units. All battle tanks had a transceiver. A program was underway to add radios to the infantry light tanks in 1939, but this had limited results by May 1940. The French problems with radio distribution were based on both cost and quality issues. The French rearmament program of 1936-40 took place amidst lingering effects of the Great Depression, and to some extent radio production was a casualty of the budget. However, it also had to do with the technical problems of radio use in tanks. Early tank radios relied on telegraphic transients, not voice transmission, and so required a crewman conversant in Morse code. There was a widespread shortage of radio operators with the Seskals due to French reliance on reservists. French military radios had a bad reputation for durability in battlefield conditions. This was in part due to the technical limitations of military radios of the period, and perennial problems such as the difficulties of operating AM radios from within tanks. It is by no means clear that German radios, though more numerous, were particularly effective in 1940, and this entire issue warrants more detailed study. Legends of the campaign. One of the most prevalent legends of the 1940 campaign was that French tanks were foolishly broken up into penny packets compared to the concentration of the German tanks in He Panzer divisions and Panzer corps. During the Battle of France in 1940, 44% of French tanks were armored and mechanized divisions DCR DLM and 66% were in separate infantry and cavalry tank units. In contrast, virtually all of the German tanks were in the 10 Panzer divisions. It isn't clear why the French would have concentrated all of their armor in mechanized divisions. And like in Nazi Germany, France's strategy was not offensively oriented. The French defeat had little to do with armored doctrine, but was caused primarily by the operational failure to anticipate and respond to Germany's encirclement through the Ardennes. French tank units, especially the cavalry's DLM, fought extremely well at the tactical level, but these actions could not overcome the profound shortcomings of the Allied high commands. From a broader historical perspective, the unusual concentration of German tanks in the Battle of France in 1940 was an aberration, albeit one that was highly successful in view of the risky German 1940 Operation Alplan. As combined arms tactics matured, the tank deployment patterns between 1943 and 1945 were closer to that of the French Army of 1940 than Wehrmacht of 1940. The British, Soviet, and American armies of 1944-45 all devoted a large fraction of their armored forces to the support of infantry divisions, while retaining only a portion for their armored divisions. For example, by the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the Soviet Army had 56% of its tanks and assault guns in the tank and mechanized corps, and 44% in separate regiments and brigades supporting the infantry and cavalry. The U.S. Army was similar, with 44% of its tanks and assault guns in the armored divisions, and 56% in separate tank and tank destroyer battalions supporting the infantry divisions. The German Army also changed its deployment patterns after 1940, gradually expanding its assault gun Sturmgeschütz and tank destroyer Panzerjäger units, so that by the final year of the war about a quarter to a third of its armor force was used to support the German infantry divisions. In Normandy in 1944, the Wehrmacht had 72% of its armored force in the Panzer divisions, and 28% in separate assault gun and tank destroyer regiments and battalions. Another legend of the 1940 campaign has been that the French army was numerically superior in tanks to the German army. While this may have been literally true, it obscures several important issues. If the obsolete Renault FT tanks are dropped from the French totals, then the tank inventories on both sides in 1940 turn out to have been nearly equivalent. While all of the German tank force was concentrated in the attack zone in Belgium and the Ardennes, the French army had several of its field armies in Lorraine, Alsace, and the Italian frontier. In total, about 885 tanks, or over a quarter of its tank force, was deployed away from the main battle zone. Many of these tanks were obsolete Renault FTs, but 585 were modern R35 infantry tanks. As a result, the Wehrmacht enjoyed numerical superiority in the main battle zone. The number of French tanks manufactured through June 1940 was not equivalent to the actual number of tank units that the French were able to deploy in 1940. The German army won the tank arms race of the 1930s. The German army started large-scale tank production a year earlier than French, and were able to maintain this lead until the start of the war in September 1939. It was not simply the numerical advantage this entailed, but rather the earlier opportunities for raising and training the new tank formations. French tank production only began to catch up to German tank production late in 1939. Furthermore, some of the statistics obscure the real state of affairs. The French government charted the date of tank delivery when army inspectors accepted the chassis from the tank plants. These dates in fact represented the fulfillment of the company's contracts, not actual delivery to army units. What is not widely appreciated was that these tanks in many cases were still incomplete. Often the tanks were delivered without turrets or armament, which were provided by government arsenals. To give some specific examples, SOMUA delivered 300 S35 tanks by September 1939. However, only 246 had actually been received by the Army in a complete state with turrets and armament, of which 191 were deployed in units, 51 were in depots awaiting assignment, and 4 were being repaired prior to issue. While the increase of French tank production in late 1939–early 1940 was no doubt a remarkable industrial achievement, it obscures the fact that the surge of tanks could not be absorbed into the army due to the lack of trained units. The French army did not mobilize its 43 infantry tank battalions until August–November 1939, and in many cases these battalions did not receive their intended tanks until 1940, training on obsolete and completélédismer FT tanks instead. France had only 2 mechanized divisions in service in September 1939 at a time when the Wehrmacht was already fighting with 10 Panzer and mechanized divisions in Poland. In reading French tank unit histories of the 1940 campaign, a central problem facing the combat deployment of these units was the mechanical breakdown of their tanks and loss of tanks due to fuel exhaustion. For readers familiar with German tank history, these problems were an echo of the German experience during the Anschluss with Austria in March 1938, when their panzer columns broke down with alarming frequency during the uncontested drive to Vienna. The key difference was a critical 2-year lead that enabled the Wehrmacht to take advantage of the earlier formation of its panzer divisions and to incorporate the lessons from the Austrian Anschluss. In 1938, the occupation of the Sudetenland and the Czech lands in 1938–39, and the invasion of Poland in 1939. In 1940, the panzer divisions were experienced and had overcome many of the ordinary mechanical and training issues that plagued the French in 1940. The French army had no such opportunities and went into the 1940 campaign undertrained and unprepared. Napoleon's aphorism "the human is to the material as 3:1" certainly applied to the 1940 campaign. French tanks after the 1940 armistice. It is often forgotten that after the 1940 defeat, our French army remained after the armistice. The Germans allowed a lightly equipped army of 8 divisions to remain in the unoccupied region of France controlled from Vichy. This force had no tanks, but the 8 cavalry regiments were each allied to platoons of armored cars for a total of 64 AMD-35 armored cars. These armistice Panpans had their 25mm guns removed and were armed only with machine guns. The most substantial French tank force remained in the overseas colonies in North Africa, the Levant, contemporary Syria and Lebanon, and Indochina. France had deployed a number of Renault FT tank battalions to colonies in the early 1920s, and some had seen combat during colonial disturbance such as the Rif War. At the start of the war in September 1939, there were 163 Renault FTs operational overseas, including 41 with the 7.5 machine gun, 89 with the 37mm gun and 33 with the 75mm BS1, Renault R35. 60 Regiment des Chasseurs Africains, Levant, June 1941. The 63 BCC was mobilized on May 15, 1939 south of Beirut in the Levant, and received its first shipment of 15 R35 tanks from the 1939 production batch, with some typical matricules being 50,805 and 50,880. A subsequent batch of 23 tanks from the early 1940 production batch was later shipped to the Levant to complete the battalion's strength, and the matricule on this tank was 51,324. The battalion was nominally disbanded after the 1940 armistice, though the tanks remained. In January 1941, the 6th East RCA was formed with 4 squadrons, each with 23 to 24 vehicles. The 1E and 3 escadrons were equipped with armored cars from the 8 East GUM, while the 2 East and 4 escadrons received the R35 tanks from the former 6th BCC. This regiment saw extensive fighting against Commonwealth forces during Operation Exporter, mainly facing the Australians. Most of the unit's tanks had few markings, but this unit, presumably the 2 Escadron, used the usual playing card symbols and a single-digit tactical number. The French go-card was carried on their rear turret corners. The color scheme is the usual 1940 pattern of army green and earth brown. 2 AMC White TBC, 70 Regiment des Chasseurs Africains, Levant, June 1941. The French army deployed the 6 East Group autocannons at automitrailleuse to Beirut in January 1920, equipped with white armored cars that had been modestly modernized with more modern wheels. These armored cars saw combat against Emir Faisal and in the fighting in Cilicia in 1920-21, and in later fighting through the mid-1920s in other regions of Syria. After several reorganizations in the late 1920s, the core of the French armored car force in the Levant became F-80 Group d'Automitrailleuses on March 1, 1933 with its 3 squadrons stationed in Damascus, Beirut and Aleppo. In the wake of the 1940 armistice, there was further reorganization, but eventually the white armored cars were assigned to the newly formed 6 East and 70 RCA, forming 2 squadrons in each regiment. This particular white TBC was knocked out on the road to Damascus in late June 1940. It is finished in the usual army green. The vehicle was named Vendredi 13 inches Friday the 13th and carries the matricule 36. The vehicle tactical number is a white 14 on the upper left edge of the turret face. It carries a blue club in the style of the former 80 gun, and in all likelihood the markings are remnants of the original markings of the armored car Group Howitzer. Of these, 105 were in North Africa, and the remainder in the Levant and Indochina. Many of these had been retired from the tank battalions but were retained at company strength for guard duties at airfields and other locations. Besides the operational Renault FT, there were large stockpiles stored in depots, with some 363 Renault FT of various types on hand in the colonies in 1941, of which about 250 were in North Africa. In September 1939, the largest concentration of colonial tanks was in Tunisia, with 3 battalions of 135 D1 light tanks 61E, 66E, 67 ABCC. These 3 battalions were moved towards the Mareth line to defend the colony against possible Italian action from Libya. They were directed under a new command, the GBC-FT Groupement des Bataillons de Chars d'Affrontunations, which was reorganized as the GBC 521 Group des Bataillons Deckers in January 1940. One of these units, the 67 ABCC, was sent back to France in the summer of 1940 to participate in the Battle of France, levying 2 battalions. Morocco had 2 Renault FT battalions, the 62 EBCC near Max and Fez, and the 66 EBCC near Casablanca and Marrakesh, both under the direction of GBC 522. The most modern force overseas was in the Levant. The 63 EBCC was stationed south of Beirut and was first equipped with Renault FT tanks, and later with 39 R35 light tanks. A second unit, the 680 BCC, was formed in November 1939 when a ship carrying a battalion of new R35 tanks for Poland was diverted after the September 1939 defeat. This newly formed battalion was stationed in Homs, and both battalions were directed by the GBC 523. The cavalry had a substantial presence in the colonies, most notably in North Africa with the regiments des Chasseurs d'Afrique RCA. At the start of the war, there were only 28 cavalry tanks overseas. The 1 RCA had 16H-35 tanks in September 1939, reinforced by 16 OH-39s that arrived in southern Tunisia in mid-February 1940. The other cavalry tank long associated with the colonies was the Renault AMC-34, also with the 1 URCA. All 12 of these were shipped to Tunisia in 1937. The bulk of the cavalry armored force in the colonies consisted of armored cars, many of them types that were developed specifically for colonial use. None of the new Panzer DAM-35s were deployed in the colonies. Shortly after the 1940 armistice, the Royal Navy attacked the French fleet in the port at Mers el Kebir on the Algerian coast on July 3, 1940 to prevent warships from falling into German hands. This infuriated the French and changed the German attitude towards French colonial forces, since Vichy France now had a reason to defend the colonies against future British operations. Besides allowing the French army to retain tanks in the colonies, the Germans also permitted some modest transfers of modern tanks from France to the colonies. The most notable example was the 100 to GACA Group Autonome des Chasseurs d'Afrique, which included 23 SOMUA S35 tanks, and was sent to Tunisia in 1941. Operation Exporter. Although these small numbers of tanks might seem like an obscure footnote to French tank history, in fact many of these tanks saw combat in 1941-42 under difficult circumstances. The first large-scale use of French tanks since 1940 took place in the summer of 1941, when British and Commonwealth forces launched Operation Exporter from Palestine to take control of the French Levant. The 95 Renault R35 tanks and the 2 battalions in the Levant had been absorbed into the 6 East and 70 UCA prior to the fighting. Besides these tanks, there were some older Renault FT tanks and about 90 armored cars, mainly old white TBCs, but also locally improvised types such as the Tannock armored trucks. The French tanks were widely used in combat during the June-July fighting, and the R35 tanks of the 7 ERCA played a pivotal role in overrunning the 1st Royal Fusiliers at Quneitra on June 16, 1941. Operation Torch. French tank force in North Africa had been substantially reorganized after the 1940 defeat. The 2 battalions of Char B1 in Tunisia were assigned to the 2 East, 4 and 5 ERCA. In Morocco, most of the modern tanks including the H35, H39 and R35 were assigned to the 1 East RCA. The Allied amphibious landings on November 8, 1942 consisted of 3 task force landing on the Moroccan and Algerian coast. There were a number of sharp tank clashes over the next few days between French and American tank units. The U.S. Army's Central Task Force landings near Arzew on the Algerian coast on November 8 ran into resistance from some white TBC armored cars. Of the 2 ERC that were knocked out by 37mm anti-tank guns near El Encore. During the advance from the beachhead on November 9th, M3 light tank company of 1 1st Armored Division was engaged by the D1. Tanks of the GAC Group d'Escadrons des Chars of the 2 ERCA from Thedefaro-Vlasini Air Base, but the French force lost 14 tanks for the loss of a single American light tank. The Western Task Force landing on the Moroccan coast also had a number of tank encounters. On November 9th, R35 tanks of the 2 East Group mixed 1 RRC clashed with a group of 7 M5 light tanks of the 166th Armored, 2nd Armored Division outside Port Lyaoudi on the Moroccan coast, and 4 Renaults were knocked out. The clashes became less common over the next few days as a settlement was reached. The Vichy French forces eventually switched sides and joined de Gaulle's Free French forces. Several off-tank units, including some D1 and S35 companies, later fought alongside Allied forces in the Tunisia campaign in February and March 1943. The creation of the Free French Tank Force is outside the scope of this book. Tank development in Vichy France. Curiously enough, tank development continued in France even after the armistice. The SOMUA S35 was the only French tank that interested the German army, and there was a tentative scheme in late 1940 to use captured French equipment to build new Panzer divisions. There was a deliberate effort to recover as many S35 as possible, and these were transferred to Thest when planned for refurbishment. There is also some evidence that unfinished 35 were completed under German supervision. SOMUA engineers continued to work on the proposed S40 cavalry tank. The Vichy government under Admiral Darlan conducted discussions with Berlin via Otto Abetz, the German ambassador, in the spring of 1941 in the hopes of loosening German occupation policy in exchange for German military rights in the French overseas colonies. A tentative set of agreements was reached in May 1941, called the Protocols of Paris. Among these discussions was a scheme to initiate production of an improved version of the S40 tank with a new welded turret developed by FCM. The turret was in large measure based on the recognition that the previous types of French tanks with one-man turrets were inefficient in combat, and the layout was clearly based on the German style of three-man turrets. A further incentive for initiating S40 production was an approach by the Japanese government in November 1940 to utilize dormant French industrial capacity to manufacture S40 tanks for the Imperial Japanese Army. The Protocols of Paris envisioned a production scheme to manufacture 800 improved S40 tanks, of which 200 would be earmarked for future French use in the colonies, and the remaining 600 tanks for the German and Italian armies. In February 1942, the French and Japanese governments reached a tentative agreement on the production of 250 improved S40 tanks for the AGA. which would be supplied 12 to 18 months after a contract was signed. The protocols of Paris were never fully implemented, and no small measure due to Hitler's strong distaste for any scheme that would allow France to rearm. Nevertheless, the French government continued a small-scale tank development effort in the hopes of winning Berlin's acquiescence. The focus of the S-40 program shifted from the SOMUA plant in occupied Saint-Winthoth FCM plant in an occupied Marseilles. The Germans were kept informed of progress on the nouveau Char B1 French tank. FCM developed two alternative designs for the tank, a two-man turret armed with the existing SOMUA S35 gun, and a three-man turret with the more powerful 47 S37 gun. The program was openly discussed with the Armistice Commission and reviewed by the CIF Commission Italian d'Armistice avec France, Italian Armistice Commission with France in September 1942. At the time, the Vichy French government was proposing a reduced production scheme for the French army of 135 SOMUA tanks for 3 squadron groups in North Africa, plus the proposed Japanese order as well as any tanks the Italians and Germans might wish to order. The program came to a crashing halt in November 1942 following the Operation Torch landings in North Africa, when the French army there quickly switched to the Allied side. The Wehrmacht occupied the remainder of France, disbanded the Vichy government, and disarmed the French Armistice Army.